thinking about a variety of different texts that I might be able to use for Father's Day message. This one jumped out at me, the story of Abraham and Isaac. We will look at this in detail here in a moment. But before we do, I wanted to have us take a moment and try to see if we can think of the most difficult thing that your father ever did on your behalf. Is there any one moment that sticks out and you say, man, my dad really stepped up and did that for me? Maybe it was a moment, when he did something. Or maybe it was just the kind of long-term sacrifice of working that hard job to provide for his kids, or whatever it might be. What was it that your father did? What sacrifice did he make for you? So think about that for a moment. And now that you've done that, did your father ever have to weigh your own life in the balance against doing what he thought was the right thing? I hope not. Because to choose to let a child go, in service to a greater good or in service to some other reason must be one of the most difficult things anyone ever has to do. How could any loving father make that choice? And yet in our text this morning, Abraham is going to be faced with a choice like that. We'll look at the text and see how he deals with that. Beginning in verse 1. Verse 1 of chapter 22 of Genesis says, "Sometime later God tested Abraham. He said to him, 'Abraham, here I am,' he replied." It says sometime later God tested Abraham. That sometime later follows the previous chapters, which tell us about the miraculous birth of Isaac. So we are following the triumph, the absolute triumph of God's mercy towards Abraham because of the miraculous birth of a son in his old age. And we also are following the vindication of Abram's faith in God. As we know, he was known as Abram before he had Isaac, and now he is Abraham. He has been vindicated because of his faith. Genesis 15:6 told us that Abram believed the Lord, and he credited it to him as righteousness. So faith is certainly an amazing thing, but isn't it nice every once in a while to have your faith proven correct? To put your trust in someone or something and to actually have that come to fruition so that you can feel the triumph of having chosen correctly. You can say, I was right, I knew it, that was correct. And that's how Abraham feels at this time. He must have felt pretty good. Pretty good about life, about where his life is going. Up until recent years, he was in a bit of turmoil, right? Who's going to inherit after me? God said I'm going to be the father of many nations. Well, this is a joke, right? It was cruel. It was difficult. He tried the whole thing with Ishmael. And God said, no, I've got a child of promise for you. So he's probably feeling pretty good, pretty confident in his relationship with the Lord. I chose the right God. God called me out of Ur, and I am doing the right thing. Everything is good. And now we have a test. And as we always see on those screens on the TV, this is only a test if it had been an actual emergency. Well, in Abraham's time, this is going to be an emergency. But what we know about this test is a couple of things. We know what God isn't doing. We know that God isn't tempting Abraham with evil because it is not in God's nature. He doesn't know evil. He can't tempt someone with evil because he doesn't know what it is. He has never experienced it because God is holy. James 1:13 reminded us of that. God cannot tempt anyone with evil. The devil, on the other hand, when he tested Jesus in the desert, he was testing him with evil. He was trying to make him fail. God's purpose is, of course, different. So what is the purpose? Why would God test Abraham? Why do you test anyone? You test to prove the lesson has been learned. I guess we could use this analogy now that school is out. Teachers aren't cringing quite so bad at hearing about tests, nor are the students. You test to find out if it's been successful. Has a lesson been learned? Do they know what they need to know? A skill, knowledge, whatever. So what is God doing? God is giving Abraham a chance to prove that he has learned how and why the Lord God is different from all the false gods worshipped by Abraham's neighbors? Have you really learned anything? Do you really know me, Abraham? Do you know what it takes to be a follower of the Lord? So let us get to the text. What is the text? Verse 2. Then God said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the region of Moriah. Sacrifice him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I will tell you about. Certainly a test. It reminds us what is truly precious to us. What in our lives is so precious to us that it is more important than anything else. For Abraham, the answer was easy. His son Isaac was the most important thing that he knew in the world. Had God asked for anything else or anyone else from Abraham, this would not have been the test that it is. Lesson 1. Lesson 1 learned by Abraham in this moment. God is not the God of little and unimportant things in my life. Either God is the God of everything in my life, or God is the God of nothing in my life. Abraham is asked to give that which is most precious to him. Since we are talking about tests, you can't expect God to be happy when you bring home a C-. For some people, a C- is the best that he could possibly do. But with God, the standard is higher. And God tells him to take his son on a road trip. Some of the best memories that some of us have of our fathers are going on road trips. Packing up the family, going on a fishing trip or a trip. I remember a trip I took with my family all the way to Maine in the back of a car with my brother and my sister. That wasn't the best part of the trip, I assure you, when we were young kids. But it was a great time with our family. And those memories we have. Abraham is going on a road trip with Isaac. Now, taking him on the trip is no problem. Great quality time, nice walks, and good scenery. It's not the destination that is the problem. It is what he has been told to do when he gets there. And what he has been told to do is something alarming. He has been told to offer his son as a burnt offering. Now, Abraham is familiar with the concept. He is familiar with presenting burnt offerings to God because he has done this before. He has taken from his choice livestock, his best calf, his best lamb, and he has presented offerings on an altar to God in times past. He knows what that is all about. But for God to ask Abraham to kill Isaac and afterwards place his body on an altar in the flames is nothing short of shocking. Shocking for us to read this many years later. Shocking more certainly for Abraham to hear. But you may not be familiar that in the ancient world there were religions, and they don't even really deserve the name, that practiced human sacrifice. There were even some that practiced child sacrifice. I won't go into the details, they were horrific. They did that to appease their gods. Abraham would have known about this, but he must have been thinking, you, God? I know they do that, but you? Is this the kind of obedience that God wants? Did he really bring Abraham to the promised land and make a covenant with him, only to turn around and demand the death of the very child of promise? It is shocking. It doesn't make any sense. And I think if we look into the mind of Abraham a little bit, we can see three different options, three different ways that he might be trying to figure out what God is up to here. Option number one is Abraham might be telling himself, it's only a test. God doesn't really mean it. He just wants me to go through the motions of obeying, wants me to go up to the mountain and build the altar and put my son on it, but he will stop me before I do it. Won't he? That might be the first thing that Abraham is thinking. He might be thinking this as well, and we know from other texts that Abraham at least considered this. God expects me to go through with it, but he will resurrect Isaac after the sacrifice. The birth of Isaac was a miracle. Why couldn't God do this too? Has God ever proven to Abraham the power over death? Can he bring back a child that has been consigned to the flames? Those are big questions and a huge risk for Abraham to take, to put his trust that God can raise the dead. Well, the third option that Abraham might be considering, the one that's probably at the back of his mind worrying him, is that maybe I don't really know God at all. On the surface, the Lord may have appeared to be different, but in the end, maybe he's just as cruel and bloodthirsty as all the other so-called gods that I know about. It can't be right, can it? I mean, is that possible? Could I have been so wrong about God to have not seen this coming? How could Abraham possibly know who God really is? He staked his whole life on the Lord and following him, but maybe he's been wrong. Now that might seem a little bit out there. Maybe you're dismissing that and saying, oh, come on, Abraham didn't actually believe that God wanted human sacrifice. But we know God, and this is an irony. We know God better than Abraham did. He spoke to God, yes, but he didn't know God. He didn't have the cross and the empty grave to look back on and say, no, we really know God. Maybe he was wrong. Maybe that's what God really wanted. So those three things, I think, in varying degrees, are in Abraham's mind, in his mind as he begins. Verses 3 through 5. It says, early the next morning, Abraham got up and saddled his donkey. He took with him 2 of his servants and his son Isaac. When he had cut enough wood for the burnt offering, he set out for the place God told him about. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. He said to his servants, stay here with the donkey while I and the boy go over there. We will worship, and then we will come back to you. It says early the next morning. I think some of you are lost right there. You might want to obey God, but early the next morning might be stretching it. Regardless of what option Abraham's mind had settled on, he chose to begin to obey God as soon as possible. And there's lesson number 2 in this story. We may not always understand why God asks us to do something or not do something, but we are far better off when we begin to obey first and let the explanation come later, if it does. How can we possibly obey without understanding, you might be wondering? The only way that you can obey without understanding is trust. I'm glad Sue chose trust and obey, because I was thinking about that song as I was working on this text this week. We know our Heavenly Father. We know that God desires good for his children. The passage from Luke that Jesus was speaking confirms it. God only knows how to give good gifts to his children. The foundation of obedience is always trust. And for Abraham, obedience was a process. It took him several steps and several days to come to the crisis point. If we refuse out of hand to obey God, if the moment we realize we need to do something, we say, forget it, I'm not going to do it, we'll never get to the point of testing our faith and refining it and being put to the test so that we can grow. But in the end, Abraham had to climb the mountain. He had to climb the mountain with only Isaac at his side. The servants had to stay behind. You know, in life, our friends, our family, they're very helpful. They are necessary. We need them. But we must all stand or fall before God on our own merits, as we will all stand before the judgment seat one day on our own. Verse 5 also gave us an interesting thing. Abraham said, we will worship and we will come back to you. And many people have commented on this text and said, well, that was Abraham showing confidence. He knows that Isaac is coming back with him. Possible. Look at those 3 different scenarios I outlined. The first one, that God's not going to make him go through with it, well, then that would be wishful thinking, right? Abraham is saying, we will come back because I'm sure God's not going to make me go through with it. In the second scenario, he might be talking about his confidence that God can raise the dead. Even though I'm going to have to go through with it, we will come back. If it's the third one, this is Abraham whistling in the graveyard. We'll come back, but he doesn't necessarily know that. Imagine the mind of Abraham. Put yourself in his shoes, so to speak, as he steps closer and closer to the summit of the mountain. Every step bringing him closer to the moment when Isaac may be lost forever. Let's look at verses 6 through 8. Beginning in verse 6. Abraham took the wood from the burnt offering and placed it on his son Isaac, and he himself carried the fire and the knife. As the two of them went on together, Isaac spoke up and said to his father Abraham, "Father?" "Yes, my son," Abraham replied. "The fire and wood are here," Isaac said, "but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham answered, "God himself will provide the lamb." And the two of them went on together. Isaac notices. Isaac, as they go up the mountain, says, yeah, something's missing here. He could see that his father had everything they needed to make an offering except the sacrificial lamb. Isaac apparently himself aware of making sacrifices to the Lord. He's been part of it. He's witnessed his father do it before. And so he says, Dad, don't mean to interrupt you. You are getting up there in years. Did you forget the lamb? There isn't a lamb. We need a lamb, Dad. Yeah. At this point, you think Isaac thought something was wrong? He knew they needed something for the sacrifice. They didn't have it. But his dad said, God will provide. Abraham offers him an ambiguous answer, isn't it? The Lord will provide. Will God provide a lamb? Or will Isaac himself take the place of the lamb? In the first option, they don't need a lamb. If God is going to stop him, there isn't actually going to be a sacrifice, it's just a task. In the second option, they don't need a lamb either, because Isaac is going to be the lamb, but he will live to tell the tale of it. And unfortunately, the third one is in the back of their mind, of Abraham's mind. If Isaac is going to be the lamb, and this is it, then the God that I thought was God is not God, and I have made a great mistake. If Isaac is the lamb, interestingly, God has already provided, hasn't he? He provided Isaac by miracle, by bringing him into this world. Perhaps in the back of Abraham's mind, he's thinking, do I owe him? Do I owe God this son because he provided him for me? Samuel's mother thought something like that after she prayed for a son. Let's look we've got one more bit before we get to verses 9 through 10. They continue along. They walk up the mountain together. By now, there must have been, I think, an odd tension in the air. The relationship between father and son strained by a problem that Isaac doesn't understand. You would imagine that Abraham was quiet. He wouldn't have been joking. He wouldn't have been chit-chatting with his son as they walk along, as they build towards the moment. Let's look at verses 9 and 10, the crisis moment, the moment of truth. Verse 9. When they reached the place God had told him about, Abraham built an altar there and arranged the wood on it. He bound his son Isaac and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then he reached out his hand and took the knife to slay his son. Abraham proceeds toward the sacrifice of his son. He builds the altar and he arranges the wood. He is getting everything ready. All the while, Isaac is wondering, I'm sure, Dad, I know I mentioned it earlier, we need a lamb, and you said God's going to provide one, but we're ready to go, and there's still no lamb. And then Abraham begins the process. He begins the process of sacrificing his son. I've always wondered, how was Abraham able to tie up Isaac? There's a couple of options. Either Isaac didn't resist because he was too dumbfounded and too confused by what his dad was doing, and he was tied up before he even knew it. Or maybe Abraham overpowered him. And that kind of asks us, how old was Isaac? Because every son can probably remember the day when he first realized, I actually think I can whoop my dad. And next time we wrestle, next time we tussle, I can take him. Now, most of the time we were woefully wrong about that, and and we were probably 12 and thought I could whoop Dad, because we thought Dad was getting old and infirm and he had to just put us back in our place. But eventually that day comes. And evidently either Isaac didn't resist or he's not yet at that day. And now we see Abraham with knife in hand. This is the point of no return. Once this knife plunges down, all the speculation about what God is really up to is a moot point. But at this moment, it could be one of all three of those. Abraham has no idea which. Let's look at verses 11 and 12. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven, Abraham, Abraham. Here I am, he replied. Do not lay a hand on the boy, he said. Do not do anything to him. Now I know that you fear God, because you have not withheld from me your son, your only son. Now I know that you fear God. The angel of the Lord stops Abraham. After all, it was option number one. It was a test, and God never intended for Abraham to go through with it. No need to resurrect Isaac, and certainly no bloodthirsty God to appease. That option, thankfully, is forever closed here. The angel tells him, do not lay a hand on the boy. It was not necessary for Abraham to go through with the sacrifice, nor would it have been in keeping with God's character, because the sacrifice would have been pointless suffering, even if God raised his son from the dead afterwards. This is not the God that we worship, one that would do that in order to simply glorify himself. That is not God. So what does Abraham's obedience tell God about him? A couple of things. He tells him, number one, that Abraham considered obedience to God to be a top priority, even when he had doubts and confusion, even when he didn't know what God was up to. He still considered obedience to be a priority. And it also told God that nothing in his life stood between himself and God. Even when the love of a son, is a clear imitation of God's love for his own son, there are few things more noble and pure than love of a father for a son. God appreciates that. And yet, that did not stand between Abraham and his obedience to God. You see, we must offer up to God even the pure and the good things in life, because God will give them back to us. And what did the text tell Abraham, about God? A couple of things. Number one, it told him that God does not treat us like pawns in a game. Even though he did have the power to resurrect Isaac, God would not have hurt his creation just to glorify himself. That's not the kind of God we serve. And it also told Abraham that God does not want us to commit evil acts in order to obey him. It is a lesson in the true nature of God. His holiness is beyond our comprehension, certainly, but God exists outside of evil. We may know it far too well, but God does not. And once and for all, Abraham can put God in a separate category from all the gods around him. He is not like that. And yet the story doesn't end there. A sacrifice still needs to be made, verses 13 and 14. Abraham looked up, and there in a thicket he saw a ram caught by its horns. He went over and took the ram and sacrificed it as a burnt offering instead of his son. So Abraham called the place, the Lord will provide. And to this day it is said, on the mountain of the Lord it will be provided. You see, the salvation of rescue, the keeping of Abraham from sacrificing Isaac, does not solve the sin problem. And here we have a beautiful analogy. And here we have an analogy of Christ that we all recognize now when we read this story through New Testament eyes. God provides a substitute ram to take Isaac's place. And because of that, he names the place, the Lord will provide, Yahweh-Yireh. Thousands of years later, another son will be on the verge of being sacrificed. Only this time, no angel will interfere to stop it. In fact, This time, God the Father will turn his back on his one and only Son, as Jesus bears the sins of the world on the cross. So this episode is a beautiful analogy of the sacrifice that the Father will make on our behalf when he sends his Son. And it also reminds us that God knows the pain that Abraham has been through. Abraham obeyed God, but didn't lose his son. When God sent his Son to be our Messiah, there could be no substitute. A perfect sacrifice was needed, and only Jesus could provide it. I ask you, how many fathers love their own child this much? To be willing to let him die that many others might live. That's how much the Father loved us. We have a little bit of a postscript here, verses 15 through 18. Then the angel of the Lord called Abraham from heaven a second time and said, I swear by myself, declares the Lord, that because you have done this and have not withheld your son, your only son, I will surely bless you and make your descendants as numerous as the stars in the sky and as the sand on the seashore. Your descendants will take possession of the cities of their enemies, and through your offspring, all nations on earth will be blessed because you have obeyed me. The angel of the Lord repeats to Abraham the promises that he heard in the covenant. Third lesson that Abraham learned this day: obedience in faith to God is rewarded. His obedience leads to our salvation, because the lineage of Christ can be traced all the way back to Father Abraham. Three quick things of application, and those are the lessons that I pointed out as we went. God is God of everything in your life, or he's God of nothing in your life. Difficult, but true. Secondly, trust and obey. God's word will not ever lead you astray. You don't have to wait for the explanation. You can begin to obey today. And lastly, we know, because God has promised, obedience